Hello, this is a beginning of an oral video history of my grandparents, Jim Chapman, and my grandma here, Jessie Chapman. Jessie Evelyn Chapman. Back in December the 4th, 1918, in Invercargill, just north of here, Grandma, Jessie Evelyn McLaughlin at the time, was born. Now, over 83 years later, we're back here in Green Hills, standing on a strip of pathway to Grandma's childhood home next to an old Microcarpa hedge. But first of all, let's just set the picture of Grandma's grandparents and heritage. From Green Hills, where Grandma's father was brought up, to Stewart Island in the distance, to near Fort Rose and Otara, where Grandma's mother was brought up. This is the McKinnon home in Otara. That's Grandma's mother's place, taken around 1902. And so here we are in Otara, which is south, well, the most southerly point almost of New Zealand, and it's sort of quite a wee way east of Bluff, although not too far. And it was here where Grandma's mother's side of the family lived, and where Grandma's mother was born. Her grandparents, which are my great-great-grandparents, they came by ship in 1874 from Glasgow, Scotland. And the father, well, he was a tenant farmer, or his parents were. That meant that they worked on a farm that was owned by a big sort of lord fella. And then he was also a carter, which apparently was something to do with carted goods, perhaps, and sheep, carts or whatever, I don't know, horse and cart. But anyway, him and his wife, they popped across here from Glasgow, and they moved here in Otara. And that there where the grey implement shed is, that was where the house was. And you might be able to see some of the tree stumps, which were probably planted back in their time. And here they ran a dairy farm. So Grandma, this is where your mother was brought up, and it was on a dairy farm.
Yes.
Did she used to help out on the farm?
Oh yes, she helped out on the farm. She was milking cows before she started school. I think she said she milked cows from the time she was 4.
And how did they milk cows back in those days?
Oh, by hand, of course. And then the milk would be taken down to the dairy factory, which is not far away, and made into cheese. It was a cheese factory in those days. And then when the cows were out in the winter time, later on, as she grew up, she went to Invercargill, having to drive to Edendale for starting the Helsing trap, and then catch the express train from there to Invercargill.
And
she learned dressmaking.
Back in those days, it would have been pretty muddy around here. What type of clothing did they wear?
Oh, yes. Well, as far as I know, just the long frocks which were in vogue, and I don't know what they wore on their feet, whether it would be gum boots then or just boots, some sort of boots. But I know she said sometimes there was so much mud about that the mud was up to the girth of the horse, and so she didn't ever like long frocks for wearing in the daytime when they were fashionable in the 60s or 50s.
This is Otara itself, which is about 2 kilometres away from the old McKinnon home. That's the sea in the distance. And this church here has a pew in it, which, what does it do, Grandma?
Dedicated to Donald McKinnon, my grandfather. He left a section for a church to be built, but it couldn't have been built for many years after he left it, and they decided that they'd sell his section. And so they dedicated a pew. It has a little plate on it saying, "Don McKinnon Pew."
But did they speak Gaelic normally?
They must have spoken quite a bit. When they had any Gaelic-speaking friends, especially, and I guess the family must have spoken it a lot, because my great-grandmother was fluent in it, as was her sister Mary, and Aunt Janet and Katie, who lived in Canterbury. They had been able to, but of course they lost it a lot because they didn't know how to use it with.
And so from Atara, we're now back in Green Hills, which is home to Grandma's father's side of the family, the McLaughlins. And over in this little bit here, around near these flax bushes, this was where Grandma's father sort of spent some time. Well, this whole area here, as a matter of fact. Grandma's dad was born here in Green Hills, and her great-grandfather was the first white boy to be born in Green Hills. Grandma's great-grandfather, which is my great-great-great-grandfather, or grandparents, they had arrived by boat to Bluff from Victoria in Australia. When they arrived, the great-great-great-grandfather of mine, he was a foreman on the railway that was built from Invercargill to Bluff. This mud here of Bluff was probably a change of environment back from the days of Victoria, when he used to cart stores to the Victorian goldfields. But he probably enjoyed the environment a little more, because as the story goes, he was once robbed by Nick Kelly's gang. And up there where those row of trees are, they were there back in Grandma's time. And on the cusp of the hill there, with the hedges, well, that was where Grandma lived as her childhood home. In fact, this whole sort of region over here where the McLaughlin clan lived, it's a bit of a, dare I say it, inbreeding? Let me expand further. You know how I said about the James McLaughlin, who was the chap who had been robbed by Ned Kelly's gang, and how he and his wife came across here, and their son, also called James McLaughlin, was the first white boy to be born in Greens Hills. Well, in his early 20s he was still quite an eligible bachelor, and he had a sister as well, a younger sister, whose name was Jessie McLaughlin. And anyway, between them, their two first cousins, a brother and a sister from Victoria, came across to Bluff, and within 1 week both of them had a wedding ceremony's bells went off, both got married to their alternate brother and sister, first cousins married. And from that union was Grandma's father. And just about your father, during the First World War, did he go to war?
No, but he was in camp, and at one stage I was told he was on the wharf in Wellington waiting to be sent away, but for some reason they held him back, and he just had the rank of corporal, but he was training soldiers, you know, in sort of like physical education type thing, or whatever they did in physical training.
So he was quite lucky in a sense then?
Well, he was really.
And was he married at the time?
Yes, he was married. He was married in 1916. And I don't know just quite when he went to camp. It must have been soon after that. Because, and Mum said that she stayed, when he was in Trentham, she stayed out of a hut, just boarded with some lady there. And then later he was up in Taranekau, and she stayed up there with some.
This is a photo of Grandma and her brother Alan in 1922, when Grandma was aged 4. While this is Grandad Jim's father's place at Four Peaks, it is very similar in design to Grandma's house in Green Hills. And here is a side view shot of Grandma's house in Green Hills. This is part of the house now. Where the vegetable garden is may have been the bedrooms. Where that back glass house is would have been the end of the house.
Probably the front veranda would be along there somewhere.
And then we're turning around to the old chimney, Grandma. So Grandma, how many bedrooms?
Well, there were 3 bedrooms, 1, 2, 3 bedrooms there, and there was a chimney, a double chimney, between the 2 front bedrooms, the front bedroom and the next one, because in those days most of the heating was done by open fires, and then the dining room and the sitting room were on this side, and each had a fire in it. That chimney may have been in the sitting room and the dining room, but I'm not sure. And then the kitchen had a coal range, and then there was the wash house, which had a copper in it.
What is a copper?
Well, a copper was a copper where it was built in with concrete around it and a fire underneath to boil the clothes. Water was poured into it and heat was heated in the clothes sheets and things, which were mainly linen in those days. And a lot of clothes were boiled in that, and towels would have been boiled in the copper, and then washed out in the tub and rinsed and so on in the tub. I think from memory we had cold water over the tubs, but no hot water in my day.
And how did you have a bath or a shower?
Well, there was, when I was very young, there was no bathroom. There was quite a big pantry and then a scullery, which is a place where you wash the dishes, but not just in basins, no sinks, you carried the water from the kitchen. And but later, what had been the pantry was turned into a bathroom, the bath and hand basin.
And how often would you have a bath?
Well, once through the bathroom, we probably had one when we felt like it. But in the early days, we had a tin bath, which a lot of people had, and that would be filled with water in front of the range, and you'd have a bath there and that once a week, I suppose, perhaps a little more often. And in each of the bedroom there was a basin, very nice china sort of basins, and in each one would have a jug. I think they called that a ewer, E-W-E-R from memory, and it was always filled with water, and hot water would have been brought, and you had your washing in that. Any visitors could wash in that. That was done in most houses.
And how many people could fit in the bath at one time?
Oh, well, just one mainly. Although, as kids, often, if Isla was my cousins were staying, a couple of us would get in. But just had one.
And who built the house?
Well, it was my grandfather who had it built. I don't know who built it, but he had it built. And I think it was about the time Dad's youngest sister, Myrtle, who was 21 years younger than my father, around about the time she was born, I think, so it would have been today about 92 years old.
And you heated it how, the house?
Well, it was all by open fires. Often you'd have an open fire in the bedroom, which was very cold, especially when I got asthma as a child.
During your childhood years, did you ever get sick?
Well, not often, except for getting asthma, which I got quite a lot. And often I'd be up my poor mother would be up most of the night with me. We used to burn a powder called asthma powder, and at one stage I had asthma cigarettes. And when I was looking up some of the old newspapers to try to find out about my great-grandfather, I read that asthma cigarettes contain marijuana. That was advertised in newspapers in the 1860s.
Did you have to smoke them at the time, did you?
And it sort of brought up the phlegm, and I suppose perhaps allowed me to go to sleep a bit, but no one realised there was anything wrong with anything in them. But I didn't take that for long. Then we had ephedrine tablets. The doctors knew very little about asthma in those days.
Did many people have asthma?
Well, we didn't know. I didn't know many, you see, who had it, but found out later that in later years, lots of people had it. Lots of my friends, some of their children had asthma. When I was young, I didn't really know anyone else with asthma. So. Well, I just hated it. But fortunately in time grew out of it. But when we used to go to the sand hills as kids, down in Green Hills, I'd come home and I'd have asthma at night, and Mum thought it was the beach, but actually I know now it would have been the lupins on the sand hills in January, because there are a lot of lupins growing over there, and I've never been a great fancier of lupins.
Did you have to leave the area for a wee while?
Well, one time the doctor, when I was about standard 1, I think, the doctor suggested that maybe a change of climate might help, so we went up to Aunt Janet's up in Montalto in mid-Canterbury, near Mayfield. Stayed there for about 3 months. And I went to Montalto school with my cousins, but not all the time, only a short time. And one time we went down to Timaru, to the bay, Timaru, the beach there, and I got asthma that night, but I think that was the only time I had it in 3 months I was away. And for the next year I didn't get it at all. I got an attendance certificate from school, the only one I ever got, for not missing more than, I think it was 5 half days you could miss to get. So that was very good.
How did you keep, what did you use for lighting?
Well, we used to have lamps until the electric power came, after the Monowai power scheme was built, and that was in the early 1920s. I'm not sure which year, but we did get it put on as soon as the power came through here. And we just had the lights at the time, and perhaps, I suppose an iron perhaps.
Did you use candles?
Yes, we used candles, but mainly lamps. Various sorts of lamps. Some of the ones that today are greatly sought after, but I think there would have been one of those perhaps in the sitting room and maybe in the dining room.
Was there a problem of people's houses getting burnt down?
Well, not like this seems to be today. I guess some of them were, but I don't remember there being many.
And what about a fire brigade here?
Don't know anything about a fire brigade. There may have been one at Bluff and one in Invercargill, but certainly none around here.
And where did you go? How did you go to the toilet, or where?
Well, it was a tin, some sort of a thing, a special building outside. There used to be one somewhere down there, and another later on was shifted up the hill, up a bit and back there somewhere. And it had to be emptied into a hole, which was dug. I didn't have anything to do with it, but it had to be done fairly frequently.
Did it smell?
No, because I always kept it clean.
So if you wanted to go to the toilet at night time?
Oh, well, you had a hose, they were called in those days. Again, today, many of those are antiques and used for planting things in, because a lot of them were quite colourful.
And how did your mother refrigerate food?
Well, you couldn't refrigerate anything. You had a safe in the cool part of the south part of the house, and it was amazing how things did keep, just things were kept in safes.
This is the view from the crest of the hill where Grandma's childhood home was. She said ever since living here she's always liked to live in an area with a view. We're looking on the way towards Invercargill, although back in Grandma's time there was much more scrub and marshland. That's looking down towards Bluff, and those buildings just closest to us are also Green Hills. Just on the other side of the buildings is Green Hill School, where Grandma used to walk to go to school. Going to school, Grandma, you had to walk to school, did you?
Yes.
Along this track?
Yes, down the hill. The hill seems steeper than it does today, but Wasn't it very steep? Down there and round and down the main road to school, nearly a mile away.
And was it mud?
Oh no, it was gravel. Because there's plenty of gravel around Green Hills, around there's always gravel.
And who did you walk there with?
Oh, on my own or then with Alan later, I suppose, and Alec Bremer. We used to meet Alec Bremer, a neighbour from down there. We used to meet at the corner with him. We joined the main road. We walked together. But mainly when I went to high school, Alec and I walked. And later on when Alan started, he had a bike and he was always at the last minute on his bike.
And it was safe in those days for children?
Oh, yes. It was great fun. That was all scrub down there, Manuka scrub down there. A lot of the land's been cleared since, of course. And the quarry over here. One of the things we had to watch as children was that they weren't firing shots to shoot the stone out, because occasionally bits would come right over near our house. I think they used to call out fire or something and we had to take cover. We was warned about that.
And when you were walking, what happens if it was raining?
We just accepted anything like that. We'd have coats on, I suppose. I don't know. We didn't worry about things like that when I was young.
There were no parents picking children up in cars?
Oh, well, there were no cars around the place. The first cars here wouldn't be until, I don't know, it was the late 30s. There were very few cars in Green Hills until after the war. But we used to go everywhere by train in early days, and then later when the buses went on, we went by bus, because instead of having to walk to the station, we just walked to the corner of the road down there.
We're now looking at Grandma's old place from the back of it. There are the old trees. That's the new house that's there. The water there is the bay where Grandma and her friends and her brother Uncle Alan used to go down and play in the channels and have a bit of a splash around and swim. Sometimes they'd come further up the channel. It was all native forest, all in the foreground, right down to the base there, all gorse. Now the channels that they sometimes came to play in with their family, and during the summer they'd sometimes go and play in those sand dunes. Over there. The Green Hills School, Grandma. How many children were there when you were there?
Well, I think there would have been in the 50s, in the numbers 50s, perhaps even the 60s when I was there. I'm not just sure.
Did you have a uniform?
No, we didn't ever wear uniforms.
And how many teachers were there?
Just 2 teachers all the time I was there. I had 4 teachers altogether, I think. One for my first year in the infants, and then another one until I went into Standard 3. Then a man teacher from Standard 3 to Standard 6, and Standard 6 had another man teacher.
Was there corporal punishment?
Oh yes, plenty of that, you know. Talking, I used to get the strap fairly often. But I didn't worry too much about it. I suppose it couldn't have been too hard, or I would have given up talking when I wasn't supposed to be talking.
Where did you get the strap?
On the hand.
And was there any more serious punishments other than the strap?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't think so, but the boys sometimes might have got more than that. And some children did get punished for not knowing their tables or their spelling or something like that.
So what type of things were important in terms of education back then?
Well, the 3 R's, reading, writing and arithmetic, main things. But we had music and we had I can't remember much about the phys ed, but we must have had some sort of phys ed. And what else? We'd learned geography and history.
And so, were you ever sports-minded as a child?
Oh, well, we used to have, yes, we had a lot of sports in a way, when I think of it now, a lot of them athletic sports. And Green Hills School, some of the people performed very well at the Southland area sports. One of the things that they had was called solo skipping, which was you skipped with a rope and did sort of dance steps with it. And I was in that under 10, but I didn't win. The winner of that section was a girl who was a very good dancer. So I didn't learn dancing, but I remember going to a dancing teacher in Invercargill for a short time before the sports. I must have had to learn some steps from him to satisfy the Green Hills people. But there were a lot of very good dancers at Green Hills who competed in various competitions and won.
And when you weren't at school at home, did you have chores to do?
I'd dried the dishes. It was the time when you often decided you want to go to the toilet and take a book and to dodge them occasionally. But on the whole, because Aunt Mary lived with us most of the time, and Aunt Mary was fairly soft on Alan and me, and so we could dodge things a bit.
What were your parents like? Were they quite strict?
Well, Dad was away from home a lot, and he was fairly easy. I don't ever remember him ever causing me much trouble. But Mum, she was a fairly good disciplinarian, had to behave. Taught manners, and we were brought up fairly mannerly in our day.
And at that time, when you were, say, before your age 10, what did you think you wanted to do when you were an adult?
Oh, I wanted to be a teacher because I had several cousins who were teachers, and Mum boarded one of the teachers, and I remember one or two relievers coming, just staying with us when she didn't charge them any board. And Flora Webb, who was with us for about 2 years, was in not very good health at the time, and Mum used to give her a breakfast in bed at weekends, and sometimes she'd lie in bed all weekend, and she'd have her sisters to come and stay, and there was no money in it, but Mum enjoyed it, having the company, because Dad was away a lot contracting.
You mentioned how your father often spent a lot of time away from home. Where was he and what was he doing?
Well, his father was a road contractor. Mainly they booked roads, and in those days in Southland there were lots of new roads to build and to maintain, and it was mostly done by horse and dray and shovel and all the hard work, and blasting rock. My father had a certificate for using, it was quarryman's certificate I think it was called, so he could blast the rock. And so they were often away, various places wherever they got a contract.
And how long would each period of time be?
Oh, well, sometimes he'd perhaps get home for a weekend, but depends how long the contract took. Some of them would take months, I suppose, but he'd get home a few times.
How did the family cope without their dad being around?
Oh, well, Mum was a good manager and we managed fine,
And she was quite accepting of his job?
Oh yes, in those days you had to be. I mean, someone had to go away. She didn't like him being away. He didn't like being away either, but it was the thing to do. If you wanted a job, you went where the job was.
And was that his job all his life?
Not really. I can remember at one stage he worked in the cool stores at Bluff. Perhaps they had no jobs on at that time. But he used to get home every night. That was great fun. So
were his skills more in man management and labour?
Yes, that was, because he left school. He did get a scholarship in his year in Standard 6 when he had to sit proficiency and so on. And he left school at 12 because he should have been able to go on to high school, but his father didn't believe much in education, thought they could get by without it. So, but he was very good at maths and could write well and read well. But a lot of people could at that age if they were well taught and if they were bright enough. They could do what a lot of children, some of the people with years at high school today know better.
And what did he encourage his children to do?
Oh, well, he was keen on us to do things. He was very keen on music as well, and he played the violin. And He used to, when he was home, often played for dances with Ivy, his sister, Auntie Ivy. And then later, perhaps sometimes with Myrtle. He was a lot younger, of course.
And what was his involvement on the Milford Road?
Well, at that stage, during the Depression, at some stage there, the Public Works people asked him to go with them. They wanted him as a foreman at the time, and his father probably had no contracts just at that time, and so Dad went with the Public Works and stayed with them for a few years, but then his father persuaded him to go back contracting him. But I think he only stayed a short time because Mum rather liked him being in full employment, a job that went on that he knew he had, rather than sometimes having contracting work and other times nothing. And they sent him over to Milford as an overseer, and then during the war he was in charge of a group of men. I think it was all done under the Public Works, but who were putting in gun emplacements up on Bluff Hill. And then after the war he was in charge of land clearing schemes which were run by the Public Works. So he travelled a lot throughout Southland, going to interview farmers to see if they would take up the offer of having these machines to clear their land of bush and to drain it and so on. So that was mainly what he did, and I suppose he estimated the cost and things like that.
Was there ever any people going, what about conservation, what about the ducks?
Well, of course there were duck shooting seasons in those days. I mean, there was no open slather with ducks.
Or the marshland animals, like now, that are protected.
Yes, well, I don't know about, I suppose you were supposed to shoot pikiko or anything like that. Nor native birds then, but in the earlier days when he was young, nobody worried. There was so much bush about and so many birds that I think they shot them with shanghais.
And what type of characteristics did you think you got from either of your parents?
Well, honesty and I suppose helpfulness. You're supposed to be trained. Well, we were always taught that if you went anywhere, you dried the dishes and did various little jobs, which I always did if I stayed with cousins, or once I boarded too, when I was teaching at Tuatapi, I always tried to dry the dishes for Mrs. Young, who had a lot of men for meals.
And they called you Jessie Evelyn. Why did you get called Evelyn though?
Well, I was supposed to be called Jessie, according to my mother, after Aunt Janet, I think. And but when Dad registered me, he put the Evelyn on. And years later, not long before he died, I think I asked him where he got the Evelyn from. And he said, well, there was a very good racehorse called Lady Evelyn. So he added Evelyn to it. And then I was called Evelyn, I think, just because it was my cousin Jessie, and I think there were a few other Jessies around. So I was called Evelyn.
Was Evelyn a common name back then?
No, very uncommon, really.
This is the local church that Grandma went to. She went to Sunday school here as well. This is in Green Hills. Green Hills School. There's nothing left here now when Grandma spent 7 years here, plus another 6 months later teaching. So from Green Hills, the school was located probably where that gravel area is. And across the road from the school was the old railway station. You may be able to see the railway there, and that's where Grandma used to catch it to go to high school, and also when later in the years when she was teaching at Likes of Clifton and Waihope High School. At age 12 you then went to high school in Invercargill.
Yes, to Southland Girls High School, where I spent 5 years, and I managed to stay in the A classes all that time, but it wasn't that I worked as hard as I should have, but I just managed to stay there. And I took Latin for the first 2 years and until Easter of the third year, so I was able to stay in the A class. You could change then to geography and still remain in the A class, otherwise I'd have had to go into a B class if I'd changed earlier. And in my time, at the end of the fourth form, everyone had to sit junior free place. Now I think that was the only year that everyone in the whole of New Zealand sat that exam. Before that, if people were failed at school, they had to pay for their education from then on, unless they sat matric and passed it. There was no seventh form as such in those days. There was 6A and 6B, and after one got matric, you had a year in 6B and did higher leaving. And in my case, we sat training college entrance. Another thing, we had to actually sit as an outside exam. And the ones who went to 6A did bursary, and that gave them more money to help to pay for their university education.
Being a girls' school, did you have to learn how to cook and dressmaking and things like that?
Well, in the A class, we had a certain amount of that. My first year, I think we might have, I don't know whether we had sewing or not. In Form 4 we had cooking for, I suppose, just a period, perhaps two periods a week. And then in the sixth form I remember having to have sewing because we had one period that wasn't filled up, so we had to have sewing then.
But were there sort of really ladylike stereotypes in those days? Or did that pass?
Well, you expect it to be. Yes, you're supposed to wear your gloves in town and your hat and not talk to the boys on the street. And
why weren't you allowed to talk to the boys?
I don't know. It wasn't the thing done. Some of them did, of course, but it wasn't the done thing. And we had to crock, as they called walking up in a 2x2 up the street from the railway station to high school each day. The bluff girls, trained girls did. I suppose some of the other trained girls would have to too. You had to stay together, you couldn't just wander off. And then at night, because our train didn't leave till 5:10, we had to stay at school till about 5 to 5, and then we all crocked down to the railway station. Unless you had a special note to say you had to go do some shopping, or in my case, after Alan went to high school, 3 years after me, I went to music after school, as he did too. Before that we'd gone up on a Saturday morning to learn music. He learned the violin and I the piano. And
during a lot of those times when you finished your primary school and began high school, it was the Depression era in New Zealand.
Yes.
What are your memories of those times?
Well, it didn't affect us very much because, although Dad, I suppose Grandfather didn't get the contracts, the road contracts that he'd had before, that would be cut back. But Dad he had joined the Public Works about that time, or a bit before that, I think. They'd wanted him to go to be a foreman, and he spent some of the time on various projects that they had. One stage out at Riverton, where they had a single men's camp doing roadworks, and Dad was the overseer for that. And so he always had a certain amount of salary coming in. It wasn't big by any means. And we always had our own, a cow or two my mother liked milking, she liked a cow, or 2 cows sometimes, and she would separate the milk, and we had plenty of cream to eat or wanted to use, and she made butter. And we had hens, and sometimes she'd sell some butter. I suppose to a grocer, and sell eggs sometimes. But also she always gave eggs and cream and butter and things like that away to any town friends we had, and Invercargill friends.
What was the sort of standard food that you would eat?
Oh. Well, I suppose porridge for breakfast, but the men, they could have cooked bacon and eggs, but I don't think I had much. And toast, and the toast would be made on a wire toaster over the coal range, over the coals. It was good toast. And of course all my time at school I had to take lunch, cut lunches with us. And I think I used to make my own lunch when I went to high school. And I remember making, I think I made Allen's too in the last year or two, because Mum would be milking the cow and so forth. And then at night we'd have dinner, and I know Mum was a great soup maker and made beautiful stew. There was plenty of meat, you know, and vegetables, and plenty of fruit. She'd buy, well, we always had a good vegetable garden, and also gooseberries and black currants. And there were lots of blackberries growing wild, and we'd have blackberries, so blackberry jam. Of course, they made lots of jam, all sorts of jams. And used to buy cases of fruit, either at the auctions in town, in Invercargill, or sometimes she would write to some of the orchardists in Roxburgh, around that area, and get cases of fruit sent by rail, collect them at the station, and great job carrying them home. But we had an old pram that was used for transporting things like that from the station, because there was no car or anything like that.
So what were considered treats for a young kid?
A treat perhaps was tins of pineapple or tinned fish. We'd have fresh fish, but you know, a treat was tin of salmon, probably, or tins of pineapple. That was about.
What about lollies?
Oh well, lollies. We got lollies sometimes.
What about potato chips?
No, I don't remember potato chips. I suppose there might have been fish and chips. I don't remember that, any of that. But I loved ginger, and I often used to buy, say, 6 months worth of ginger for myself, preserved ginger. Take that. When I went to high school, you could get two bananas for threepence, I think. So often I was, you know, given threepence, I could buy a couple of bananas to have for my lunch.
So did you get pocket money?
Not as such, but Mum used to make her own bread occasionally, but not always. Often when I was at high school, I'd have to bring home bread. Sometimes buy a bit of meat to bring home, but I think mainly Mum got that when she went to town to shop, perhaps once a week or so. And if there was, you know, there'd be change, and I could have that, be threepence or sixpence. So
during the Depression years, was there a noticeable gap between the rich and the poor?
There would have been, but you know, we didn't suffer too much, because the women were so capable, and with having a little bit of land, everyone had food, you see. And Mum would sew, she made her clothes. I didn't have a bought coat until I was in fifth form. I think it was the first coat that was actually bought in the shop. Before that I had ones that she'd made. She'd buy materials, and she was a very good sewer. But sometimes you had the maid at a dressmaker too.
Was there unemployment benefit for people who got laid off?
No, there was nothing. I don't know how. Some of them were in pretty dire straits, but they had these work camps set up, and they'd have something for the married men doing drainage work around Invercargill, and the single men's camp. But others, I don't know how I don't remember there being any dole as such.
Was there an increase in burglaries?
No, I don't think so, Chris. No, I don't think so.
What about,
There'd be perhaps more, might have been a few more people wandering around, swaggers as they'd be.
Did you see many swaggers in your area?
No, I just remember, yes, there'd always be someone, I mean, not all the time, but every year or so, there's someone carrying a swag in the back looking for a job.
Was Bluff a very cosmopolitan place in those days?
Oh no, there were quite a number of Maoris. It was just Maoris and whites. But we hardly ever went to Bluff, because we always went to Invercargill for music and for shopping, and so Bluff, we just didn't go to Bluff much.
Did you have many Maori friends?
Well, at Green Hills there was really only one Maori family, and their mother was white actually, but we just knew them, just like the rest of the kids at school.
Can you remember?
And then at high school there were a few went to tech, some of the Maoris, and they used to come up to the dances at Green Hills. And when I was young, well, a lot of the families went as a family to the dance. The kids danced, and the parents danced. It was the only way they could go out. There were no babysitters as such in many cases.
Can you remember the first time you saw a Chinese person?
Oh, there were Chinese in Invercargill. There were Chinese laundries in Invercargill in my young days, But there wouldn't be many Chinese.
What about black Africans?
Oh, I don't remember seeing any of those really.
Or Indians?
I can't remember Indians either, such in the Kyle.
It's now time to try and make some sense of Grandad Jim's ancestry, which is made a bit complicated in the fact that we're dealing with two separate Chapman families. Where here behind me is the Grange, and I'm in East Otago near Dumback, which, and this whole area here ties in with the story. Firstly, let's start with Grandad Jim's father, who was named Charles. Now, Charles's father was named William, and he came out as a teenager with his parents and other siblings from England in 1859. The story goes that one of William's brothers was left on the port, and the captain wouldn't turn back because the ship was going with the tide and they couldn't turn back, so c'est la vie. Charles's mother was named Bridget, and she was Irish. The story goes that her parents died in the potato famine and she was brought up with nuns. And in the early 1860s, the women in New Zealand were scarce, short supply, and so Bridget had her passageway paid out here to come to New Zealand. So that's Grandad's father's side of things. Grandad's mother was named Margaret, and her heritage is also a separate Chapman family. Firstly, her father was James, and he also came out from Scotland with his parents, and they went to a farm on a station near Balclutha called Clydevale Station. Margaret's mother was called Jemima, and she also came out with her parents from Scotland and moved close to Clydevale Station near Balclutha. So, James and Jemima Chapman had Margaret Chapman, and they were living in this region of Dumback. And close by were another completely unrelated Chapman family with their son named Charles Chapman. And both were farming families in this region. And in 1914, the two Chapman neighbours, Charles and Margaret, got married. And then, soon, not too far later, on the 1st September 1915, Grandad Jim was born. How's that? This is a photo taken at Ashway, and it's Grandad Jim in the middle, next to his mother, his grandmother on his father's side, and his brother Harry. This is the homestead area of Ashway, where Grandad Jim was born and where he spent his first childhood years. Okay, Grandma, this is Ashway where Grandad Jim spent his early years. Do you know until what age he lived here?
Well, he lived here till he was 8 and his mother died, and after that he and Harry spent most of the time at the Grange. I think it was handy to school, Dunback, and also I think they came home to the father's place here at Ashway at the weekends.
But first of all, when they lived here, can Grandad Jim have much memory of his mother?
Yes, he remembers her, and the last year or two she lived in a tent outside the house somewhere because she had TB, and in those days there was so little that could be done for it. They thought fresh air was one of the things, and but she died here.
They thought she may have died of pneumonia then?
Oh, well, it was the TB that caused it, I don't know, Chris.
And did she have TB for that long?
Yes, I think so.
So did
She must have got it after when Max was born, but it was fairly common in those years.
How did you catch it?
Whether it came from milk, as often, cattle had TB and there'd be no testing in those days. So whether raw milk or what, I don't know. But it was common and it was easily transmitted from one person to another.
How well did Grandad's father cope with the death?
Oh, I suppose, I don't know how he coped in those days. But he batched, as far as I know, for years. And then in 1929 he sold the place and went up and bought another place at Four Peaks, Geraldine.
Naturally, this is not the exact same house as the Ashway house, but it's on the same location, maybe foundations. And this is looking out the back of the house. Don't know how old that shed is, although there's a real smell of eucalyptus trees, and very big ones which may have been planted back then. So Grandma, where does Grace Chapman fit into all this?
Well, after Jemima died, James's wife, at the age of about 57.
Of what?
I don't know, can't remember. Might have been a heart attack or something. He remarried and married her friend Grace Stenhouse. But she would have been in her 40s, I think, when they were married, and they had no more family. And she didn't want to be called Grandma, so they all called her Auntie Grace. Well, her stepdaughters called her Grace, but Jim and Harry and Max and the other daughters' families called her Auntie Grace. So. But she was really their step-grandmother, you see.
And what role did she take in bringing up Grandad Jim?
Well, she... the three boys later, or especially Jim and Harry, the older ones, they stayed at the Grange from the time their mother died to go to school, because it was much handier for walking to school.
That top left-hand room there was apparently where Grandad Jim would have slept as a boy. But this whole building here, it was built in 1863, and all the stonework is still the original stuff, 140 years later. And as you can see, it's quite good nick. And apparently, it's a big place, and they used to have maids here as well. So obviously the old fella had a bit of money. Yeah. What did Grandad Jim appreciate about Auntie Grace?
Well, she gave them stability, I suppose, and was a good home for them. They were brought up. I mean, she had fairly strict ideas on behaviour and so on, but they had lots of fun because they could get out into the paddocks up the river.
What was Grandad Jim's childhood sort of hobbies or whatever? Do you know?
Oh, played lots of sport at school and roundabout. And but he remembered one time in the Shag River, which ran through the Grange property, he and Harry had a shovel and something, and they were trying to get some gold out, and Auntie Grace stopped them from doing that. I don't know why, but she didn't let them do that. But she thought they'd get drowned.
And Grandad Jim could ride a horse?
Oh, yes.
Did the Grange have horses?
Oh, they would be sure to have had horses. His grandfather had a very early motor car called a Crit, I think it was. And I think he drove it a bit like he'd drive a horse, G-up sort of style. Jim had lots of stories to tell about that. And especially going up some of the hills and coming down them. I think it was fairly traumatic driving with old grandfather. It was coming into depression times, and Jim was thought to have the brain, so she sent him to Toga Boys High to be educated and also to board. And it was thought that farming wasn't a very safe thing in those days, and so he could be something more. He could be a teacher, so that's how it was mapped out for him.
Otago Boys High School, where Grandad Jim went from 1930 to 1935. That was from age 14 to age 20. And he was a prefect. He represented the school in the first 15, and he was the boxing champ and the shooting champ. And his sons Alistair and Ian also went to the school where they boarded. We're in Four Peaks country here. We're on Chapman Road, and it extends just up round the corner there. Back in 1929, Charles Chapman, which is Grandad Jim's father, moved here and bought a farm and owned the property up in this hill country here. And he was here until the early 1940s. So, how much did Grandad Jim have to do with this place here?
Oh, he just came here mainly at holidays, and he used to help his father with jobs on the farm always at that time of year, whenever he was here.
Did Charles Chapman run the farm on his own?
No, in the earlier years, once Harry left school and Max left school, they both worked at home for some time. I don't know how long. Harry will be able to tell you. And but one of the problems with it was that Charles, Grandad, paid too much for it, I think. He bought it just at the beginning of before the Depression. The Depression came and land values dropped and there was no money in sheep or anything. And there wasn't enough flat land for good grazing in the winter, and I think he often had to send stock onto the plains for grazing. So it wasn't a very viable farm. And when the war came, and both Harry and Max, well, before that, Harry had gone to work at Long Beach, at Griggs at Long Beach. And when they both joined up and went overseas, Grandad's health wasn't very good, so he just had to walk off the farm, really. He went to live in a little cottage in Geraldine and worked at the linen flax factory at that time, because during the war they couldn't import jute, I suppose, to make bags, and so they set up flax factories in some places, and one was in Geraldine. So he lived there really until he died, but he was down at Harry and Shirley's when he died, via Nakarua.